transatlantic slave trade forcibly uprooted millions of Africans, condemning them to a life of brutal exploitation on American plantations. Enslaved people endured unimaginable cruelty at the hands of both male and female slave owners, who wielded absolute power over their bodies, minds, and lives. The cruel institution of slavery not only shattered families and identities, but also controlled the most basic aspect of human existence: food. Frederick Douglass, a former slave and prominent abolitionist, recalled the dire conditions of life in the plantation. Hunger was the young Fred's faithful boyhood companion.
I have often been so pinched with hunger that I have fought with the dog, Old Nep, for the smallest crumbs that fell from the kitchen table, and have been glad when I won a single crumb in combat.
He wrote in his book, My Bondage and My Freedom.
Many times I have followed, with eager steps, the waiting girl when she went out to shake the tablecloth to get the crumbs and small bones flung out for the cats.
Malnutrition and starvation were deliberate tools of oppression. Plantation owners provided scant, spoiled, or rotten food, intentionally keeping enslaved people on the brink of starvation. This systematic deprivation aimed to break spirits, diminish resistance, and maintain control. Meager rations left enslaved people weakened, vulnerable to illness, and struggling to survive. This keeps them a great deal susceptible to their masters' whims. Today, we embark on a poignant journey through America's complex and troubled past, where the legacy of slavery and racism has left an indelible mark. We'll be diving into the heart-wrenching narrative of the Black experience, scarred by centuries of systemic oppression, brutality, and injustice. But before we go in fully, consider supporting our efforts by subscribing to our channel. Like and help us share this video all across the globe. Now let's get down the road. The slave diet, a meager and monotonous regimen, was designed to sustain life just enough for enslaved people to toil on plantations. Fatty pork, corn, and rice formed the backbone of the slave diet. However, enslaved Africans, upon seeing the meager rations provided, took initiative to create their own food by planting, hunting, and improvising meals from available ingredients, thereby giving birth to dishes like tripe, neckbone stew, oxtail soup, and ultimately soul food. Soul food was a cuisine deeply rooted in African American culture and history. It originated from the traditional cooking styles of enslaved West Africans and African Americans in the southern United States. Characterized by hearty, comforting dishes made from humble ingredients, soul food typically features rich flavors, bold spices, and slow-cooked meats. Classic soul food staples include fried chicken, collard greens, black-eyed peas, cornbread, macaroni and cheese, candied yams, and gumbo. In the face of oppression and scarcity, enslaved Africans demonstrated remarkable resourcefulness by crafting soul food from scraps and leftovers. They transformed pig feet, neck bones, and other discarded parts into flavorful stews and soups. Vegetable peels, scraps of bread, and leftover grains became nourishing soups, stews, and breads. This culinary ingenuity not only sustained bodies but also fostered resilience and community. Former slaves such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs wrote about the creative ways enslaved people repurposed food. Douglass recalled how enslaved people made ash cake from cornmeal and water, cooked in the ashes of fires. Harriet Jacobs, in her book Incidents of Life, described how enslaved women used okra to thicken soups and stews. Soul food played a vital role in African American family gatherings, celebrations, and cultural identity. It brought people together, providing comfort and solace during times of hardship. After emancipation, soul food continued to evolve, incorporating new ingredients and cooking techniques. Occasionally, enslaved people also received cornmeal, salted fish or meat, and some vegetables from their enslavers. However, these rations were frequently spoiled, rotten, or infested with insects. Cornbread, a staple in many enslaved communities, was made from cornmeal, water, and sometimes salt. These people were compelled to sustain their souls and body by having to feed through very austere ways, provided it would keep them living for as long as it would take. This all became something. Techniques for preparing cornbreads were passed along, made from batters that could be as straightforward as cornmeal, mixed merely with salt and water. These were fairly similar to kush kush, a spiced and baked cornmeal dish that Mr. Richards would say is the most closely tied to Africa. It's descended from kusha, which was brought to West Africa by North African Muslims. And a contemporary cousin is couscous, a Cajun-fried cornmeal slurry, Mr. Twitty said, an American culinary historian, author, and chef, specializing in African-American and Southern cuisine. Historian Ulrich Bonnell Phillips, an American historian on slavery of the South, found that slaves received the following standard, with little or no deviation.
A quart liter of cornmeal and half-pound of salt pork per day for each adult and proportionally for children, commuted or supplemented with sweet potatoes, field peas, syrup, rice, fruit, and garden sass, which is also referred to as vegetables.
For the most part, slaves' diet consisted of a form of fatty pork and corn or rice. Cornbread was commonly eaten by slaves, and sometimes produce from a vegetable patch or garden could also be added to the rations. Frederick Douglass, a former slave, an author and abolitionist, recalls the experience on plantations.
We were rarely permitted to cook our food. Our cornmeal mush was cooked in a large iron kettle. The mush was poured into a trough, and we were allowed half a pint per man.
Cornmeal was essential for survival among the enslaved, whom Frederick Douglass referred to as hunger-smitten multitudes. They took the meager rations that were granted to them and developed methods to stretch the ingredients, from mixing up a cornmeal mush for children to eat from a trough, en masse, to baked or fried varieties that could supplement and sop up watery stews made with vegetables and/or a bit of meat. Prepared by African Americans to feed themselves and those they labored for, these recipes spread from the enslaved person's quarters outward to the big house and the kitchens of whites high and low, writes Mr. Twitty, such that cornbread is now generally considered to be a Southern culinary tradition, having lost some of its original identity over time and through appropriation. In light of zoo archaeology, there are some reports that suggest that slaves were generally well-fed to ensure high levels of productivity on plantations. Other reports suggest there were differences in the nutrition of slaves based on their status. Slaves who worked in the fields or otherwise had a heavy workload were fed a little more, while slaves who did not have the heaviest workload, like women and children, were not as well fed. As a result, malnutrition was the leading cause of death for babies and children of slaves. Since most part of the land was reserved for agriculture, meat was an expensive rarity on colonial plantations. Children were considered important assets, but not as valuable as adult males. Consequently, meat was often not included in the diets of enslaved children until age 10, at which time they were allotted a serving of pork on most days. This included leftover parts the slave owners did not consume, like the feet, tail, tongue, or intestine. The rations of pork, a generally parasitic meat often consumed by European slave owners, and corn provided to adult slaves, were sufficient to prevent death from malnutrition, but failed to provide all the necessary calories and nutrients for the labor-intensive work of a field slave. Although the quantity of food given to slaves remains a subject of debate, what seems to be agreed upon is that its quality was poor, very poor. The inadequate diet forcefully imposed upon enslaved Africans was the precursor for the poor eating habits that have been traditionally found in the African American community, putting them at higher risk for chronic illnesses. The pre-colonial West African diet consisted primarily of vegetables, as many people were farmers and ate the produce generated from their farms. Enslaved Africans also brought about the plantation of watermelon, okra, yams, black-eyed peas, and some peppers in the U.S. during the antebellum era, and today these foods are commonly eaten in the U.S. They show how Africans who were forced into slavery, beginning in the 1500s, influenced the American diet. In 2008, Frederick Opie, a history teacher at Babson College in Massachusetts, would publish a book about some of the foods that connect Africa and America.
The book titled Hog and Hominy is about the soul food from Africa to America. If you know what people eat, you can find out where they're from.
Frederick Opie, the author, confirms. Opie explains that people who were bringing enslaved Africans to North America wanted to keep them alive and earn a profit. As a result, Africans on the slave ships were fed the kind of foods they knew and liked. Those foods landed along with the people. Opie explains that fruits and vegetables brought from Africa grew well in America. One reason is because enslaved Africans planted their own gardens to help feed themselves. In time, the plants from Africa slowly moved from the gardens of the enslaved to those of the wealthy and powerful whites. For example, the homes of the U.S. presidents George Washington and Thomas Jefferson had gardens planted with seeds from Africa. These fruits and vegetables changed the way cooks made pies in America. In England, pies were made with meat, but African Americans took the English meat pie and made it with fruit or vegetables such as sweet potatoes. Kelly Dietz, a contemporary historian and researcher who studies and writes about the culinary history of enslaved people in the United States, analyzes historical documents and records to understand the lives and experiences of enslaved people. With her frequent conducts on oral histories and interviews with descendants of enslaved people and other experts, she interprets archaeological evidence from plantation sites and other historical locations. Through her research, Kelly Dietz aims to reconstruct and honor the culinary experiences, traditions, and contributions of enslaved people, shedding light on their lives and cultural heritage. On this particular occasion, Kelly Dietz was at the Stratford Hall in the U.S. state of Virginia, and the writer of a book about the influence of Virginia's enslaved cooks named Bound to the Fire. According to him, Virginia's enslaved cooks included Hercules, a man who worked in the home of George Washington. Washington's family loved Hercules' cooking so much that Washington's step-grandson described Hercules as one of the best chefs in America. Washington praised Hercules' cooking so much the president was reportedly angered and surprised when Hercules escaped and sought his own freedom. Yet for the most part, the author, Kelly Dietz, says that the skilled black chef has been written out of American history. In fact, both their work and their skills shaped American food. For example, enslaved cooks developed gumbo, jambalaya, pepper pot, and a mix of green leafy vegetables and pork called hop and john, says Dietz. And she adds, some ways of cooking that are well known in the U.S. today were reported in West Africa before 1500. They include deep frying fish and barbecuing meats. Dietz says these kinds of foods were critical to the creation of Southern, and in time, American food. Many of these foods with roots in African American culture came to be known as soul food. History professor and author Frederick Opie says the name was created during the Black Power movement of the mid to late 1960s. It was a way to identify food that showed the history of African Americans. He adds that soul food is also food that African Americans began to create a long time ago, to eat with dignity as enslaved people in the diaspora. As enslaved Africans adapted to the limited food options in America, they creatively combined traditional African ingredients they had brought with them with available American resources, resulting in the improvisation of new dishes and ultimately the birth of distinctive African American cuisine. Vegetable patches and gardens provided a vital supplement to the monotonous diet of enslaved people. They cultivated essential produce like sorghum, cowpeas, eggplant, and collard greens, which added vital nutrients and flavor to their meals. Other notable crops and recipes from the gardens of enslaved individuals include 1. Rice. On plantations across the Americas, enslaved Africans struggled to survive on meager rations provided by their masters. To supplement their inadequate diet, many slaves turned to cultivating their own crops, including rice. Originating from West Africa, rice was a familiar staple for many enslaved Africans. However, on plantations, rice was often withheld or rationed, forcing slaves to improvise. In response, they planted rice in hidden patches or provision grounds, small areas allocated for personal cultivation. Cultivating rice allowed enslaved Africans to maintain a connection to their cultural heritage and traditional farming practices. Using techniques passed down from their ancestors, they planted, harvested, and processed rice by hand. Rice became a vital component of the enslaved people's diet, providing essential carbohydrates, fiber, and nutrients. It was often prepared with other available ingredients, such as beans, vegetables, and scraps of meat. They also used rice to sustain themselves by incorporating it into meals like pilafs, soups, and desserts. Jollof rice, a classic staple in Nigeria and Ghana, morphed into jambalaya. West African rice and beans dishes, called waki in Ghana, and thibu nibe in Senegal, became the South's hop and john. The cultivation of rice by enslaved Africans underscores their resourcefulness, determination, and resilience in the face of oppression and scarcity. Number 2, okra. Okra was a vital crop grown by enslaved Africans on plantations. Introduced from West Africa, okra provided essential nutrients and versatility in cooking. Okra is found in many African dishes, especially in the stews they serve out of big cauldrons. In the American South, okra is probably most well known as the ingredient found in gumbo. In fact, okra is what helps thicken gumbo. Yet this technique draws directly from Africa. The word gumbo comes from the Bantu word for okra, ki ngombo. During the slave trade, they brought with them their appreciation for okra, including it in stews that are signature to soul food. Number 3, sweet potatoes and the potato hole. Sweet potatoes, introduced from Africa's Congo region, were a life-saving crop for enslaved people on plantations. Rich in vitamins and minerals, sweet potatoes helped combat malnutrition and related diseases. Enslaved people baked, boiled, mashed, fried, or roasted sweet potatoes, making them a staple in their diets. Sweet potatoes closely resembled the yams harvested in West Africa. The crop can easily grow, even in less than ideal soil. Slaves could cook them over fire or wrap in leaves and ash roast. Sweet potatoes were also grown in hidden gardens, providing enslaved people with a sense of autonomy and self-sufficiency. This crop symbolized nourishment and comfort, reminding enslaved people of their African heritage. Storing the potatoes and other root vegetables over the winter may have been a subtle act of rebellion. On plantations, African American slaves constructed potato holes, often near the fire, where they would bury their sweet potatoes. This secret hole was hidden from plantation owners. It became a small way for slaves to create their own personal space. As small as they were, these potato holes allowed a tiny sense of privacy and self-control in a life that rarely had boundaries. Number 4, corn. Corn was one of the most versatile crops eaten by American slaves. As Booker T. Washington recounts in his Slave Diet Bulletin, a common breakfast was cornbread and pork. On days when that wasn't available, he'd head to the animal shed. There, he'd steal some of the boiled Indian corn kernels used to feed the cows and pigs. Frederick Douglass also describes a similar use of corn.
Our food was coarse cornmeal boiled. This was called mush. It was put into a large wooden tray or trough and set down upon the ground. The children were then called like so many pigs, and like so many pigs they would come and devour the mush, some with oyster shells, others with pieces of shingle, some with naked hands, and none with spoons.
Number 5, greens, stewed flavor. Collard greens originated from Africa's Mediterranean region, specifically the Ethiopian highlands. They were introduced to the Americas through European colonization and African slavery. Collard greens were a vital component of enslaved people's diets, providing essential nutrients like vitamins A, C, and K, calcium, iron, and fiber. Enslaved people cooked collard greens in various ways, including stewing with pork or bacon, onions, garlic, and spices, boiling with salt and pepper, sautéing with garlic, onions, and sometimes meat, and braising with liquid. Collard greens symbolize resilience, as enslaved people adapted this crop to harsh conditions. They also represent community, as shared meals fostered unity and strength. Furthermore, collard greens connected enslaved people to their African roots, demonstrating resourcefulness as they used every part of the plant. In traditional recipes, collard greens are stewed with pork, onions, garlic, and spices in Southern-style cuisine, while African-style collard greens are sautéed with peppers, onions, and peanut sauce. In slave culture, these big pots of stewed greens drew a direct resemblance to the stews of Western Africa. Ethiopia's Gomenwat and Ghana's Kontamire stews both resemble the stewed collard greens of the American South. As described by Carol Graham, a former slave from Alabama.
Greens were cooked in a big black wash pot, just like you boil clothes now.
Number 6, yams. Yams, introduced from West Africa, were a familiar crop for enslaved people on plantations. Rich in complex carbohydrates, fiber, and minerals, yams provided essential nutrients. On antebellum plantations, enslaved Africans faced chronic food insecurity due to their masters' inadequate provisions. In response, many slaves turned to cultivating yams, a staple crop from their West African homeland. Yams provided a reliable source of nutrition, rich in complex carbohydrates, fiber, and essential vitamins. Enslaved Africans planted yams in hidden patches or provision grounds, small areas allocated for personal cultivation. These hidden gardens allowed slaves to supplement their meager rations. Yams held cultural significance, connecting enslaved Africans to their ancestral heritage. Traditional farming techniques, passed down through generations, were used to cultivate and harvest yams. The crop's familiarity brought comfort and a sense of autonomy. Slaves prepared yams in various ways, boiling, roasting, or mashing them to make nourishing meals. Yams were often paired with other available ingredients such as beans, vegetables, and scraps of meat. Yams became a vital component of the enslaved people's diet, providing sustenance and hope amidst the harsh realities of plantation life. Enslaved people also used cooking techniques like frying, stewing, and roasting to create flavorful meals. For example, enslaved people in the Low Country region of South Carolina developed a distinct cuisine known as gula. This cuisine combined African, European, and Native American influences, featuring dishes like hoppin' john, a rice and bean dish, fried fish, and okra soup. Antebellum plantations had a larger population of hogs than cows, therefore producing more pork than beef. There are a few reasons behind having more pigs than cows. A stereotype that slaves preferred pork over beef. Pigs were easier to feed, beef was harder to preserve, so it was typically only served fresh, which happened more often in the winter because the cold slowed spoiling. A fear of fresh meat because it was believed that it caused disease among blacks, which it was probably not that fresh, and the planters' conviction that hog was the only proper meat for laborers. Archaeological excavations have found evidence that the primary component of slaves' diet was meat from livestock, such as pigs and cows. And when these rations, or their personal crops, were scarce, enslaved people resorted to foraging for wild game, fish, and edible plants. This desperate measure helped supplement their meager diet, as they were able to catch wild species such as opossum, raccoon, snapping turtle, deer, squirrel, duck, and rabbit. Due to the shortage of cows, slave diets lacked milk. There was often a stereotype in the antebellum South that slaves were lactose intolerant. However, many slaves had trouble digesting lactose in dairy products because it was not a staple in African diets. Due to the summer heat and the poor quality of the animals themselves, milk became a scarce product only available seasonally. When it did become available, it was first given to whites, and if any remained, then to slave children. Scholars came to realize that the slaves' diets were quantitatively satisfactory, but not qualitatively sufficient. The poor quality of food led to slaves that were either physically impaired or chronically ill. Due to slaves' diets lacking quality, there were many vitamin and nutrient insufficiencies that lead to illnesses. At the time, they didn't recognize that these illnesses were caused by poor diet. The legacy of slavery's austere conditions continues to impact African American communities today. Food insecurity, health disparities, and systemic racism persist as ongoing challenges. However, the resilience and strength of individuals like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, Sojourner Truth, and Charles Ball serve as powerful reminders of the human spirit's capacity to endure and overcome even the most inhumane circumstances. Their stories, and those of countless others, underscore the importance of acknowledging and learning from this painful history, striving for empathy, understanding, and positive change. In this unforgiving environment named America, food became a battleground. Enslaved people fought for sustenance, dignity, and cultural preservation. Despite the scarcity and poor quality of food, they found ways to resist, adapt, and hold on to their heritage. Their story of resilience and resourcefulness in the face of unimaginable hardship is one of humanity's most profound testaments. Through food, enslaved people asserted their autonomy, preserved cultural traditions, and sustained their communities. This brings us to the end of yet another timely video segment. Did you happen to learn a thing or two? Kindly reach out to us in the comment section below to share thoughts, and we would be delighted to pick from them. Don't forget to support our works by hitting the thumb button, share with friends and families to keep spreading our eye-opening Black narrative, and subscribe to stay tuned in always. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.